Well, just as the merciless, pitiless cyborg alien says, and no, I'm not talking about the conductor, I am in fact talking about that Dalek we just heard. It is in fact interval time here at the Doctor Who prom. Daleks, by the way, the invention of the writer Terry Nation, apparently, right back at the dawning of the whole Doctor Who phenomenon in 1963. Well, that was the first half. We've been hearing music written for recent Doctors, including the latest series starring Ncuti Gatwa and Millie Gibson, but also the 10th Doctor, David Tennant, whose companion Donna Noble in that series was played by tonight's host, Catherine Tate. The music we've heard thus far was written by Murray Gold. More from him in just a moment, I'm very excited to say. The BBC National Orchestra of Wales are conducted by Alistair King and led by Leslie Hatfield. We also heard from the London Philharmonic Choir. We had Pantheons of Discord, Disturbing Toymakers and The Life of Sunday in that first half. And we heard the glorious tones of soprano Aida Garifulina. But don't stroll too far from the TARDIS, because in the second half of tonight's Doctor Who prom, we'll experience Segun Akinola's music for the 13th Doctor. That's all coming your way very soon here on BBC Radio 3.
BBC Radio 3, the home of classical music.
Come and join us every morning for breakfast. It's 6:30. Good morning and welcome to breakfast.
This is Saturday Breakfast with you until 9 o'clock.
There's 2.5 hours of great classical music ahead, and let's get Sunday started.
Set yourself up for the day the Radio 3 way, with great music and company.
A blast of musical sunshine, bringing some sparkle to your morning.
Wake up with BBC Radio 3.
Breakfast every morning from 6:30.
Listen on Radio 3 and BBC Sounds.
Messages there from my esteemed colleagues on The Breakfast Show here on Radio 3. And if you're a bit of a later riser, you can find me, unfortunately for you, presenting weekday mornings from 9:30. That is when I bring you a selection of essential classics. So do join me tomorrow morning at 9:30. But don't worry about that now. You're listening to The Interval at the Doctor Who prom. Georgia Mann here on duty in the Radio 3 box. And as the Cybermen head backstage and have a well-earned G&T and the Daleks reduce the Albert Hall dressing rooms to dust, I'm pleased to say that I'm joined now by man of the moment, Murray Gold, the composer whose life-enhancing music has filled the halls so far this evening, and presenter of the Sound of Cinema programme, which you can find on Radio 3 3 Saturdays out of 4, and whom I personally think should be the 16th Doctor. Russell T Davies, are you listening? Matthew Sweet. Hello, gentlemen.
Well, hello. Good evening.
Hi. Murray, this is madness in here. I mean, madness in a great way. I cannot imagine what it feels like being you here tonight. I mean, I know you've been involved in a couple of Doctor Who proms, but it must be such a unique thing experiencing your music for Doctor Who in this particular format. I mean, people just bouncing out of their seats during 15, that opening number.
Yeah. I'm glad you said life-enhancing, because that is such a key phrase about what this music is trying to do, and when it's on in front of a live audience, that suddenly becomes palpable, and it's just a quality that I think is very important in music.
Life enhancing, exactly as you say, and the palpableness of it. I mean, it's just that you write this music that is so, I mean, it just hits home with such poignancy and such energy. And I suppose that's the thing about Doctor Who, isn't it, Matthew? That it's this combination, I think, of joyousness and terror. That's the weird thing.
And in fact, that was being played out in the hall tonight, because in a way, you know, when we heard the voice of Ncuti Gatwa and that sequence where he was fighting with the god of music, we were incorporated into Russell T Davies and Murray's story here. You know, music is now personified in Doctor Who. It's almost like the battleground on which some of these stories are happening. And I think, actually, because that drama was all playing out on the screens here, I think that you, Georgia, are now canonical within the world of Doctor Who, because, you know, the Doctor was talking to the Albert Hall there, and you were sitting here with your microphone.
Here I am. This is how it works. I mean, I must say, Murray, I particularly loved that Devil's Chord storyline, because that was the one, wasn't it, where music has effectively been nicked by Maestro, a particularly terrifying villain who looks a bit like an overweight Elizabeth I, and sort of sucks the music out of the world to the point where the Beatles get interrupted at Abbey Road when they're recording in 1963. I think you made an appearance, didn't you, actually on screen?
I was at the piano during the recording, and they got me for a fraction of a second, which was already too long. I did. I went to an enormous amount of effort to prepare myself for my screen debut.
And then it lasted 10 seconds.
Yeah,
It's always the way.
No, it was a firecracker moment in my life. More of a short rainfall for everybody else.
Matthew, you've experienced a few of these Doctor Who proms now too. Your Doctor Who fandom, I think it started in the 70s. You've written a Doctor Who book, audio plays since then. Why do you think Doctor Who and the proms work so well together? And am I right in thinking that the idea of a Doctor Who prom in the 1970s just wouldn't really have been
Well,
a
it
goer?
would have been very hard to imagine, really, because I think until Murray arrived, there wasn't a body of work it would have been possible to perform in this way. You know, Doctor Who's music relied on tape manipulation, and it was chamber works by composers like Dudley Simpson and Kerry Blight. So there was really nothing on this scale until Murray turned up. John Debney scored a TV movie in the 90s, but really Murray's the person who brought the orchestra properly into Doctor Who.
You mentioned Murray Simpson just there.
Dudley Simpson, yes.
That's it. I'm muddling my Murrays and my Dudleys. So can we just come back to him? Because I know that he's got a connection to that almighty instrument that I'm looking at now.
Oh, well, yes. This is something that to listen out for in the second half of the concert, when we get to Murray's music for the return of one of Doctor Who's most terrifying adversaries, Sutekh, a kind of Egyptian god. We get to hear the great organ here in the Albert Hall bellowing out these sounds. And this is Murray, he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, calling back to Dudley Simpson, who was Doctor Who's key composer in the 1970s, who wanted to get the organ was his favourite instrument, so he got it in almost every time he could. And so in the story, it's called The Pyramids of Mars. Sutekh is summoned back to life by the playing of an organ in a kind of a domestic space. But here, we've got the real thing here,
it's
properly thunderous. The gods will arrive in the second half.
I've got to say that is the most Doctor Who instrument, Murray, wouldn't you say, that the Royal Albert Hall organ? Because I mean, it does look like you could head into
We've
space.
got Anna Lapwood playing
yes!
it, which is a coup
Such
in
a
itself.
star.
I mean, a star in the instrumentalist firmament. This is the kind of opening that Doctor Who gives you. Is Anna Lapwood available to play my gig, our gig, this gig? She is for Doctor Who,
She sure is.
and it happens a lot. So yes, and I actually had this. Matthew's absolutely right about Dudley Simpson. I had it straight from the horse's mouth when I was in Australia, and I met Dudley, and I said, "What 5 instruments would you have in a Doctor Who ensemble?" And his number one choice was the organ, and it surprised me because you can just do so much with it. But I hadn't thought of it that way, and actually Anna gave me a bit of a schooling about that when I spoke to her earlier. So. Yeah, it's a wonderful instrument to have, and the mechanical. It's built into the architecture of this hall. So when you play it here, you're effectively playing the building.
Yes, and you are tapping into that time warping idea. Absolutely, you are. And speaking of which, Matthew, let's rewind through the pantheon a bit of British composers now. That Dalek who told us that the interval was happening in no uncertain terms, he's linked, or he or she, are Daleks, do they have a gender? Let's not even go there. Said Dalek is linked to another Doctor Who composer, Tristram Carey, who seems to have become a pioneer in tape-based music, I think possibly thanks to the Royal Navy.
Yes, he was. Yes, that's right. I think was he in signals intelligence or something like that, in communications?
Yeah.
But then he was the founder of the first kind of commercial electronic music studio in this country, and he set up the electronic music course at the Royal College of Music. A real pioneer. He co-invented the first portable synthesizer, the one that you'll hear on Pink Floyd records. So real pioneering figure, very interested in music concrète as well as in more conventional forms of composing.
Let's scare ourselves and hear some of Tristram Carey's Dalek theme. Freaking no.
It relies on the kind of the almost the haphazard communication of various electronic sources. They're being manipulated on tape by
Sounds
Carey.
like they're kind of doing what they want in a somewhat disturbing way. Murray Gold, what do you make of that from your Doctor Who forebear?
It's just
Tristram
brilliant.
Carey?
I mean, I love music from all across the board, and I think when you listen to that, my immediate thought is creating it, manufacturing it, coming up with it is one thing. Getting producers to agree to broadcast it is another thing. So you need everybody to be in the same mindset and seeking the same goals, and that just doesn't always happen. So early Doctor Who, everybody was on the same page about what it was trying to do. So it could make art, like you were listening to there, and that piece you could easily listen to in the Saatchi Gallery as a sound installation.
Yes.
Like nearly everything Delia Derbyshire ever did, you know. It sounds very, very strange, it's very abstract, but it's tangible and quite wonderful.
And it was a Dalek theme, so we know that it accompanies those mightily disturbing...
Yes, it heralds their first appearance. But I think one of the reasons why Doctor Who was so receptive to sort of avant-garde ideas is that the avant-garde was really cheap. And actually, for
useful.
BBC producers, it was a below-the-line cost as well.
Right.
You know, it wasn't done by... Sometimes they got freelancers in, but if you got the Radiophonic Workshop in to do stuff like this, then it wasn't very expensive. So, you know, they couldn't have possibly afforded an orchestra in those days. So, yes, as Murray said, you know, Dudley Simpson had an organ, a water gong, some odd percussion instruments, and he would get whoever played with Schoenberg the night before at the Royal Festival Hall to come in and play and do the sessions.
Whereas, you know, you've got Tristram there, can just whack out some odd bits from the Radiophonic Workshop.
Well, he wasn't a Radiophonic Workshop man, but yes, definitely.
Similar stuff. Returning back to the 1960s again, Matthew, tell us about Doctor Who's surprising history with sampling technology and a machine called the Crystal Palace machine.
The Crystal Palace was a sort of perspex box with sort of army surplus bits and pieces inside it and a fountain nib pen. And it was an early analogue sampler, so it allowed Brian Hodgson of the Radiophonic Workshop to develop these strange atmospheres and sound loops for, you know, there's a story called The Crotons. I think we're going to hear a little bit of that. It's sort of Doctor Who's story about the student rights of '68. But if we hear that, we'll know exactly what the Crystal Palace does. It's very basic and primitive, really, but it sounds like nothing on earth.
Let's hear it. Croton theme being gently conducted there, actually, by Murray Gold.
It's got a sort of Viennese...
That was him dancing.
There's a Viennese waltz in there somewhere.
It was really entrancing me, actually. I feel like you could actually bring that to a rave quite easily. Murray Gold, given Doctor Who's mighty history with electronic music and coming out of the Crystal Palace machine and all the rest of it, were you tempted when you were first approached by Russell T Davies to write music for the series? Were you tempted to offer up something electronic because of its history, or did you always want to go lusciously orchestral?
I actually did offer something electronic, but it just wasn't what they were looking for. You know, I said before, everyone's got to be on the same page, and if the producers had wanted that, that's what we would have given them, and that's what there would have been. But they were after something that brought a hugely, like you said it, life-affirming feeling to the show. And sort of all wrapped up into the reboot of Doctor Who from 2005 was one man, as in Russell T Davies's love of the show. And that's sort of included in the way that he brought it back. His love for the show, there's a nostalgia written in to the way that it was done in 2005. It's done with tremendous affection. I think in the end those otherworldly sounds, those sounds of alienating sounds, they just didn't describe what was happening on the screen in 2005. And we just took a very different approach.
And one approach being the combination of soprano and orchestra that we've been hearing this evening. Matthew, Doctor Who showrunner, executive producer and all-round colossus, Russell T Davies, in the programme tonight, is talking about the history of song in Doctor Who.
Oh, yes.
Which I must admit, as a sort of enthusiast standing on the sidelines, hadn't really known there was such a strong
surprising amount
history
of it.
of.
Yes, it's there in the 60s. The great Linda Barron sings something called The Ballad of the Last Chance Saloon in Doctor Who's Cowboy Story of 1966. John Pertwee, the third Doctor, was a great one for singing, and he introduced. There's a story where he has to sue the monster, and he does that by singing a Venusian lullaby, which goes. Clochleader Partha Menin Clach Naroon 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 Clochila Partha Jirinach Naroon Naroon Naroon. It's the tune of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. But if you do have a big hairy beast that needs calming down, that is the one to use.
Get Matthew Sweet over there with a Venusian lullaby. I mean, Murray, do you think? I mean, song is one of those things that. I mean, it can work. It works beautifully the way that you've done it here. But have you found it a useful tool at times, the human voice?
Well, there's bookends in the show. There's always arrivals and departures and sacrifices, and for those kinds of moments, it's worked really well. And then the sort of the Omen style horror chorus, which is another kind of go-to.
Yeah, choirs can sound terrifying.
Yeah, well, there's one coming up in the second half which probably does. But again, the vocal element gives you a very direct link to humanity in its fight against monsters, extraterrestrials, and various creatures from the galaxy. So when you hear a human voice, it immediately places you back in the realms of the human.
Matthew, taking us out of the human again and back to those creatures we were talking about and coming back to that avant-garde heritage of Doctor Who, tell us about Enid Blyton's nephew.
Oh, yes.
This is Carey Blyton.
Carey Blyton, who composed several Doctor Who stories in the 70s and wasn't that interested in electronic music, actually. What he did was he took kind of archaic or unusual instruments. So, like, he uses the crumb horn in one story, an ancient instrument because this is a story about prehistoric monsters. And he uses instruments like the ophicleide, which is a kind of brass instrument made for the French army in the 19th century.
Very peculiar things, and I think a serpent instrument crops up somewhere too.
Yes.
Let's hear some of this. This is here from Revenge of the Cybermen, Carey Blyton. Revenge of the Cybermen, hopefully featuring a serpent, we reckon, Matthew, maybe. We are heading towards the second half now, Murray Gold. We're on the very cusp of it. What should we be listening out in particular for now? What's coming our way that we can prick our ears up for?
Well, I mean, Segan Akinola's suite, which is absolutely wonderful. I really made my skin get goosebumps. Just a lovely man, wonderful composer, and so I'll be especially looking forward to that. There's a few surprises. Of mine, my favourite is probably The Legend of Ruby Sunday, which is right at the end and is quite scary, but then of course everything gets put to rights by the Doctor.
And what about you, Matthew? You were here for the afternoon performance. In fact, both of us had.
It's that organ. It's the thunderous organ of Sutekh. That's what I'm anticipating.
Let's get the thunderous organ of Sutekh happening. Thank you both. Murray, thank you. I know that you need to get back to your seat. Matthew, the ultimate Whovian, thank you both so much for joining us in the interval. Well, I shall just remind you, actually, that this is the most visual of proms, and it is, you'll be very pleased to hear, being filmed for television. You'll be able to see it on TV over the Christmas period. And in case you were wondering, people have gone all out this evening. The Prommers are sporting things like fezzes, referencing Matthew Smith's era. We've seen a very long scarf, referencing Tom Baker. And there are, in fact, two, I'm very pleased to say about this, two straw hats. No, they're kind of Federer wearing. No, Panama hats. That's what we said, wasn't it, Matthew? Two Panama hat wearing chaps who are the Sylvester McCoys of the crowd. So we are on the cusp of the second half now. We will be experiencing some of that music as we heard by Segun Akinola. That was what Murray Gold was telling us, and that is the music written for the series featuring the 13th Doctor, Jodie Whittaker. There's also going to be more from that sensational soprano Aida Garifulina in this half. And I will just remind you that your host on stage tonight is Catherine Tate. She played Donna Noble to David Tennant, the 10th Doctor. And now here he comes, a conductor who's worked a huge amount in the field of television and so well prepared for the Daleks. It's Alistair King.